Um, I have many questions, and yet I don't want to steal too much from the audience, especially given they're all five of you. But I would like to, I guess, address a sort of general purpose question, especially since Cynthia had thoughts on security she did not get into. That I think if we're going to discuss airports as public space and as commons, I'm not sure. I didn't feel like we sufficiently grappled enough with the security implications of this. Ben got a lot at it, but I feel like in some way we may have soft-pedaled a bit because. So I'm mentioning in my opening remarks, for example, about the protests. The sort of addendum to the protests that happened is that there was also a grassroots lawyer movement where various lawyers set up legal teams to work with the refugees and immigrants who are being stranded behind Customs and Border Patrol, and even U.S. senators and representatives who were trying to get answers to these questions were stonewalled by the security apparatus in the airport. And then, of course, there's infamous examples like Narita of detention cells and this sort of extrajudicial, extra statecraft, extra spatial space. I feel like we need to grapple with that or figure this out. And it's interesting how people are getting at various solutions of this. Yesterday, Devin and Bruce sort of suggested that the solution to the security apparatus of the airport was to disaggregate the airport. You would basically disaggregate the security functions into the city, and then you would travel to the central node. And Curtis sort of made the opposite, I thought, which was that we would, by making surveillance ubiquitous through biometrics, through the new types of technology, it would soften the wall enough between the sterile and unsterile zones. So this seems like we're sort of trying to come at it from two paradigms. So I don't know if that primes anyone here for a question of this, but I feel like we should grapple with, especially for the international gateways, there's a level of security and extra legality that no other public space train station otherwise has. So anyway, Cynthia, I don't know if you have thoughts.
I can start. Well, when you're speaking specifically about how the airports as commons, and as a shared public space, the issue morphs slightly because what we've seen is that you've got landside activities and airside activities, and all the fun stuff is on the air side. That's the post-security. And the land side is more for residents, perhaps, or people that have already left the airport, where the airside activities are more for passengers and people transferring planes. So the question is, do you program both spaces? Do you create redundant activities? Do you have the money to do that? Is that even feasible? And who do you really want to benefit? Does the benefit really need to accrue to the people that live there, where that airport is part of their community and an enormous public space, enormous public investment with gorgeous parking lots available for all kinds of things? Or does you cater more to the visitors that you want to entice to visit the city, to become part of the city? So those are the two questions, is how do you negotiate those two before the barrier and after the barrier? And the other thing with just security in general is defining the risk. What is the risk? What are you trying to protect against? What are the chances it's going to happen? How hardened can a facility be in terms of protecting people versus really impinging on their experience and their civil rights and their pleasure in being in a space? So this whole risk management theory, because you can't harden against absolutely everything. So how does that factor in? And some places may be less risky than other places, I don't know. And how you manage the risk is sort of also part of that conversation. I'll stop there.
Anyone else? Please.
Well, I think that the airport's a very secure place, actually, to be. And there's been enough bad events, terrorism and so on, that have happened that a lot of security measures are in place and continue to be put in place. And what we're going to see in the future is that the traffic jam, the line, is going to move farther away from the airport. It may move down the street where cars are being vetted before they come into LAX, as an example. The technology is being developed for facial recognition, so they know people, they see them approaching the building, and they'll be able to tell who they are and identify them and know if they're cleared passengers, frequent passengers, people who've been through the vetting programs, or if they're on the list of bad people. And so security is, through technology, is really increasing. So the whole thing, though, as a public space, and the spaces you were talking about inside the building, those are all driven by economy and what people will pay for. And how it's paid for is one of the issues in terms of it developing as public space and in a natural way, because of the way the monies come from public entities and they come from private entities, and how they come in terms of building the buildings.
Anyone else? We can go to the audience. All right, Ben, then we'll take a question.
Yeah, I think it's an extremely important point, extremely important question. If we, and I think from what I get from the panel, there's some agreement that we think things that are happening in airports first are things that we may see in the rest of cities later on, that they operate as this kind of laboratory. And so part of the challenge for security, obviously in airports, is that things happen in the world that then makes new demands on the airports, where perfectly reasonable programmatic strategies become irrelevant overnight because a new security regime comes in and says, well, we can't do that anymore. We need a different kind of system. I think part of the challenge, of course, is that you've got many different kinds of, not only jurisdictionally, but even just this question of the sort of sovereign systems, kinds of securitization at work. On the one hand, you've got these borders, you have literally international borders inside of the airports, even in landlocked systems, and so you have a federal system that is largely indicating, are you in fact able to enter into this public zone, or are we going to quarantine this person or somehow prophylactically keep them out of the public zone in the first place, which would be a kind of federal administration. Then you have the more general policing kinds of apparatuses, which may be able to anyone and anyone. We're going to look in the luggage and those sort of things, and the facial recognition kinds of systems and identification. And so this conflation between a kind of policing function and the sort of the federal functions at the same time is something we've gotten quite used to in airports, but would in many circumstances may be suspicious of outside of airports. And so this conflation. So on the one hand, I as someone who flies a lot, very enthusiastic about the idea of not having to spend going through this bottleneck of securitization at the airport, where you honor this as well. Where all that can be taking place as you move into the cities, you go as a whole sort of process going through. On the other hand, to the extent to which those kinds of extraordinary security measures, and we accept them in airports because we assume the airport is some kind of site of exception. Things that this is a special place where there's special security measures that are necessary in order for the system to work, but we wouldn't normally do this in a restaurant or in a museum or other sorts of things as well. To the extent to which that site of exception begins to become sort of leak out and become more generally radiate, more pervasive into the way in which the city works in general, this becomes something in which there needs to be a more robust discussion about the implications of that more broadly, right? Because the consequences may be ones that we find less, not worth the costs in one way or another. On the other hand, I wanted just to sort of complicate it, one last point. Part of the reason perhaps that airports have been this site of both as a kind of exception is because they've been a particular kind of hard target. Mm-hmm. And this idea of the airport as a kind of symbolic miniaturization of the city, and then this really makes them this target. They have this symbolic currency in that way that a monument may have had in other sorts of ways as well. However, to the extent to which the airport is less differentiated from the rest of the city, becomes part of the general fabric of the city more broadly, it becomes a softer target. It becomes a less exceptional site, and therefore a less interesting site into this as well. And so in a certain way, the cure may be worse than the poison, but the poison may be itself a cure.
Let's say make airports boring again.
Make airports boring, and therefore they'll be safe and uninteresting targets. Okay, yeah.
All right, questions from the audience? I have many more, but we'll go to the back with Max first, and then we'll come up here.
Hi, everyone. My question is for Cynthia, and thank you for a super interesting presentation. I totally agree with airports really need to be thinking about how to attract a wider range of public functions. And, I think that the successful American airports are already starting to look abroad for inspiration. So, I mean, I think when we're thinking about this, we could be looking to places like Singapore Changi, which, as many of you probably know, is a place where a lot of families go to have lunch on the weekend. It's a really popular place, and they're not traveling at all. They might also be looking at a place like Baku in Azerbaijan. There, it's like really popular to celebrate parties when people fly home, and so the airport actually built private function rooms where people could party in the airport to welcome people back. They could also be looking to places like Incheon or Narita, where they're pioneering layover tourism programs that even if you have 2 or 3 hours between flights, you can get out of the airport, you can see interesting things. And they might also be looking to a place like Schiphol, which has, Schiphol recognized, look, we have almost 100,000 employees here. All those people need to eat lunch every day. And so they put food trucks that are moving around, and they set up an online community where people can have an app and find out where those trucks are on any given day. So I mean, I think there's a ton of inspiring sources, for thinking through how American airports could become more interesting places. The question that I have for you, though, is you often encounter a mindset that says, no, we do air transport, that's it. So based on your experience with Amtrak, what were kind of some of the strategies that you used to sort of change that mindset or maybe open up people to more creative approaches?
Wow, okay, very good question. Usually these things happen when there's an insurmountable problem that cannot be solved any other way but through collaboration, partnership, and conversation. It could be diminishing ridership, it could be planned expansion of a facility into a community. In Maplewood, New Jersey, they took down all the signs telling people where the train station was because they didn't want people coming into their community and parking and taking the train. You have either tremendous opportunities or a lot of problems that you're not quite able to manage. And that's where people come to the table. When everything is fine, no one will talk to you. So that's been our experience with Samtrans and New Jersey Transit. So you can even manufacture a problem that gets people out to a community meeting, actually, more than brainstorming really good ideas. But it was just this idea that these facilities do not operate in a vacuum. These organizational, these authorities have a responsibility, and to and with the communities they serve. There's tremendous human social capital in these communities, in these small towns, as well as bigger cities, and it's really a shame not to tap into that. So in a lot of instances, it was like, well, New Jersey Transit, they didn't want to have the security guard be there to unlock the station, but there was the Chamber of Commerce took that on, or the Boy Scouts said, we'll do it. And it's sometimes these really small scale sort of trim tabs that actually make things happen. Really obvious, tiny problems that no one can figure out how to solve that really kind of opens the door. But there needs to be at least someone in a leadership position with some power and some vision and some authority who wants to do things differently. And then that needs to also trickle down through the agency. And of course, at the end of the day, there has to be an ability, I think, to generate some income or revenue as sort of a byproduct.
Yeah, non-aeronautical revenue will justify almost anything. You had a question.
My question is sort of like her question, but I'll ask a different question now. So I actually was thinking when all of you were speaking about airport as a commonplace, I was thinking, okay, you were talking about 1,000 years ago, the town center, the plaza, the souk, or whatever that is called, when people gather, that is where culture is, that's where you say hello to each other every day, but that's also the economic center of the city, where they trade and so on. So I was thinking, why do people go to an airport to protest? And why do they bomb an airport and try to do terrorist act? It's because it's both a political thing that people will see, because they won't demonstrate in the bathroom somewhere. They want people to see them. So where do they go so that people will see? They go to where they think people will see, either in the city center like Manhattan or go to the airport. So I was thinking, why do they do that? Apart from political message, there's an economic message as well. How can they stop what is going on to get attention so that people will give them attention? Am I saying? So my question is, how can, because it ties to Max's question about social aspect and cultural aspect, because in Hong Kong, I can't see that happening actually. And yet they protested everywhere, on the freeway, on the bridges. So I was thinking, is that a cultural phenomenon as well? That in the US they protest in the airport, and in some parts of Asia, that may not be the first place they would think of. So that's a question of different aspects.
Anyone? Want to take one?
You brought this up. I'm just thinking about
Which
no,
part are you thinking of?
I'm not passing it to you. I'm just saying the question of why in the United States there were particular protests is because the thing that was being protested was actually being done in the airport.
Well, yes, there were physical detainees in the airport, so the airport itself became really that border was there, and so that became the site of action for that.
Right.
And it hasn't been then. I personally been waiting for other protests on the subsequent immigrant bans, but I don't know if it was because no one was caught in transit, but that was the very rare occasion where there was a demonstrable action, a demonstrable group that was being detained, and you knew they were being detained because they were in flight. Social media made that possible, so that was a relatively rare occasion. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I want to come back. I have other questions, and I want to get back to this.
Let me just make
please.
one comment on that, because the United States is a young country from an urban development point of view. There's really arguably only one 19th century city in the U.S. that's Boston. And to what was being said about LA not having a center, there are lots of places, a lot of people that don't have centers, and they're a new city where the downtown got shut down because everybody moved across the county line, and they built an outdoor mall, and they did whatever. And it was Hartford, Connecticut is another place like that just sort of hasn't had that downtown center. And so I think when you're looking at where people are going, because the U.S. is young compared to Europe or Asia, where you have these established markets or piazzas or all the different things, which have always been the center of the community, even for a small one. And that I think that the public buildings, as Kurt was saying, in this case the airport, and this issue was more significant in that it was travel related, and so it became a natural home for the action. But I'll go back to what that mayor said to me, which is, the city, my city it's not an aerotropolis at the airport, my city is here, and politically, those cities, in a lot of places, the mayors or the county executives control the airports, and so they're going to be able to have that political sway to adjust that center. And I think that's why you see, airports, in the role, but at the same time, there's sort of an uncoupling or a decentralization of it, that there's an opportunity now to take advantage of.
All right, well, I'm going to ask another question before I get to Harvey, who had one, but which gets into I feel like most of our discussion has been very terminal-centric so far. So, Andrew, since you brought up in your presentation the whole surrounding periphery, and as the author of Aerotropolis, I'm very interested in this, which is that just as Joel Barreau and Edge City tried to grapple with the lack of centrality and the lack of non-public functions in exurban and edge city environments, we have the same thing with airports created at a larger scale. I'll say, by the way, Christopher, to your point is the most successful revolution I think in the last 30 years was the people power in Philippines, which was EDSA. They did storm the highway, so there was that. But I want to get to is what would a real commons public place in the periphery of the airport look like in the Aerotropolis? Because we're still not grappling with that question. It feels like there is noise landscapes of random uses. I mean, I think it's right that we should not expect a piazza to be built there and try to build a medieval town. But so far we have a abdication because of various various jurisdictions where the airport people, to Max's question, just want to focus on operations. The city doesn't really want to deal with the noise landscape around it, so we create no man's lands around it. There's tremendous amount of money to be unlocked if there's political will, like Measure M here in LA will create billions for transit. We could create millions from privatizing airport assets and use that to develop their surrounding areas. Does anyone have ideas? What does a humane aerotropolis look like? Cynthia, for 10 points.
Okay, well, speaking from my work with Southwest Airlines and their Heart of the Community program, Southwest has hired Project for Public Spaces to help them create and recreate and envision great public spaces in the cities that they serve around the U.S. And we've been running this program for them for about 5 years, and we've done about 14 projects. But what they're doing is they're focusing on existing, underutilized, underloved, abandoned public spaces in city centers that the applicants for this grant speak to us and say, this is the heart of our community and why. This is part of their corporate social responsibility work. This is part of their community outreach work. They're an airline in the urban planning and placemaking business. They take people to places that are important in their lives, and we make sure that those places have great public spaces for them to go. So their program of these public space improvements and the grant money is also for their volunteers and their employees families to have places to go and to enjoy themselves. And it's sort of a give back to their passenger community. So it's off airport, and it's often the program has been really focused on very visible public spaces. We have a long process here of actually working in Pershing Square, which is a very contested space with a lot of different partners, but that's one of their grantees here. We did Plaza de Panama in Balboa Park in San Diego, where we worked very hard to get all the museums to open their doors and use that playa as a public space. Albuquerque City Hall. So they've been projects and places that are well known, and they have a nonprofit organization that helps manage them. And it's really not a marketing strategy. The marketing people always want to get into. It's really they wanted a niche. They wanted a place where they could actually be thought leaders and contribute differently to the cities. And they kind of headhunted us and found this sort of new way of expressing themselves. And so that's one way, is where you basically invest within the decaying or challenged areas within a city and actually try to make the cities better and create those centers that may not exist.
Thank you, Chris. And then we'll take Harvey's question.
A couple quick thoughts. I'm glad you mentioned Pershing Square, because I think given what we've heard about public-private partnerships, that's a really good emerging cautionary tale about what can go wrong. And the extent to which the decisions about how a space is designed are dictated by in that case, the private owners of the real estate development that ring the park, and how that relates to, for example, the question of how we treat the homeless population and the level of security, and how aggressive that security is all part of the equation. I don't know that project is trending in particularly encouraging directions. I would say Ben's right that we focused a lot, and we should focus on the ways in which the airport and its protocols is leaking out into the city. I think what we haven't talked about is the reverse, the trajectory, and I think the local example that's worth thinking about briefly is the difficulties of connecting that growing transit system to LAX, and how it proves its kind of authenticity as an LA space by its resistance, its stubborn resistance to being connected to that network. And I think to answer your question about where the Commons begins, it's really where it has everything to do with how you get to the airport. If you're taking even the flyaway bus, but if you're taking public transportation, you join the Commons when you get on that train or when you leave your house to walk to the train station. If you come in an Uber or private car, it's a different set of equations, and it's probably when you step out of that car. I think that's another thing that places like LAX, we haven't had a robust enough conversation about what is very specifically, what is the relationship between a notion of the Commons and the Uber Lyft passenger when he or she leaves that car? How does the design of the airport, the apron, all of that, how does it reflect a certain set of ideas or priorities about publicness, about the Commons? I've heard very little from public officials in LA about that set of questions, which seems to me really crucial. So I think it's also about, it's absolutely the airport is spreading into the city, but as we, in a city like LA, which is trying to reclaim its publicness in all kinds of ways, as we try to stitch the airport back into the city, we need to be having a whole other range of conversations about where the public is, where the edges,
where the stitches are, where this is going out to the seams. Indeed. All right, Harvey, do you still have a question?
Yes. Yeah. So, just almost as a reminder, the whole security apparatus system really derived not by from what happens at airports, but what happens in planes. And the drama of a plane crash caused by a suicide bomber is the imagery, the literature, the whole shenanigan, I think. And as a result, we've created the security systems aimed at finding the bomb in the suitcase, and or the shoe, whatever. The shoes keep looking around for it, all these different kind of places. Meanwhile, terror happens on the West Side Highway because somebody takes a car and just mows people down. So there is a kind of misplaced concreteness about all of this. So the enormous costs, financial, just to rehab all the airports and build them anew in order to handle it, all of it derives from that. And it's, to me, very misplaced. And certainly much of it is beside the point. And is it so necessary? And among the costs is that it is anti-civic. So this whole thing we're doing about cities and their airports, the airport in that aspect is anti-city. And that boundary we talked about yesterday, things that these are filled empty spaces. That is, I call it my moment of fascism. And as if, because of things like what is now going on, and it's not just in New York, I mean, this is a worldwide mechanism of terror. If that seeps back into the city from the airport, then that spells a quasi-doom for the city.
Responses? Anyone?
That was
All right, that was enough.
Very good point.
Thank you, Harvey. That was an excellent comment. No responses. Do we have time? We have time for one more question. We're dumbfounded by this.
Right.
Yes. Sorry, should we cut this off, Slim? Sorry. One more. Yes. One more question. Anyone else? One in the back. We're lightning round time, folks. Please keep it short.
This question for Kurt and Andy. Kurt ended his presentation talking about mega airports. And when you talk about mega airports, you talk about a lot of floor area. When you talk about a lot of floor area, you talk about a lot of money. So if mega airports are going to happen in the future, that's what we're thinking. How are these going to be financed? Do you think this will be a P3 motivation?
I don't think that a public-private partnership is the answer for everything. I think it's more purpose-driven. When you talk about the mega airports, for example, they kind of go back to political will. If you look at what's happened in Europe with trying to add a runway at Heathrow or trying to add capacity at the airports, and you look at what the Middle East has done in the interim time, the Middle East has built 20 runways in the time that Heathrow is London's finally got planning approval to build one. And the dynamics of the airline industry are the assets have wheels and engines on them. And so they're going to move those assets and the economic development that come with it out of your community somewhere else. And so I think that the question of the financing will be there. It will either be because the public model works or there's a partnership with the private. I think that it comes back to the community. And there's been a visceral reaction to private sector involvement because over the history of time, there have been some bad actors on the private side, and so you have to pick your partner carefully, just like you would pick who you work for or who you marry. And I think if you've got to have a double bottom line, there's got to be something in it for the community, and there's got to be that social responsibility. And when you marry those two, then you get to a deal. But I think that the until we have a different system, the communities and the government entities control the airports, and it is a competitive marketplace. Kirk put the picture of the world up there. It is no longer just the U.S. being the big behemoth with 40% of all the traffic in the world, and that the U.S. leads the way. And I think Europe is sort of a good example of what not to do, because if you look at the overflying that occurs from the Middle East to North and South America, because the Europeans are still trying to figure out how to build 10,000 feet of runway. And if you think about, you build a 2-mile runway, you can extend your economy around the world. Think about Singapore, you hear it mentioned, it's an island nation, island state, and the reach that they have through aviation, and then you look at what's happening. So I think that in the end, the financing will be there if the case is there, and it's the responsibility of the community to decide what it wants. And the assets are going to move around. So it's not like I got to come build a factory in your community and I'm a partner with you for 20, 30 years because I got to have widgets coming out of the factory. My airplanes will just take off and never return. And with it will go the economic bump that comes with it. And that's what the decision is.
All right. Kurt, unless you have a brief comment, please.
Well, I think what Andy said about the planes leaving overnight, there are a number of examples of that. But the prime example in the U.S. would be Pittsburgh, which overnight, they had an airport developed for a lot of expansion, and then overnight an airline moved away, and suddenly they had lots of gates to mothball, and it's a reality. And so there has to be a give and take with each city, with the airport, the airlines, to make it work. And it's really important. If you look at other cities, like take Denver, the ability to be able to have expansion, easy expansion of the airlines into that city has made a big difference. And if you look at the population, whenever the airport opened, it was just over 1 million people, maybe 1.25 million, 1.5 million at the most, and now it's 3 million in the metropolitan area. So the airport has had a tremendous impact on the economy and the growth of that city. There are many other examples.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll leave it there. As I say, this is why we have Pittsburgh and other cities reduced to begging Amazon and cargo cult urbanism to bring back those flights. You have all been very patient. Thank you so much. Round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, all of you.